Well, thanks for joining us, Ian. So, for those of you who haven't had the pleasure of meeting Ian has earned his PhD in nursing with a focus of bioethics and his MA in bioethics with a minor in public health and a focus on health equity from the University of Minnesota. And his clinical background is in burn trauma and pediatric critical care nursing. His postdoctoral fellowship is in pediatrics bioethics, and he earned that at Children's Mercy of Kansas City. And he's authored a broad range of journal articles that support his main interest, which is how social, political, and cultural system issues affect clinical ethics and care at the bedside. He is the current vice chair of the Ethics Advisory Board for the American Nurses Association Center for Ethics and Human Rights. And we're pleased to have you with us today. So thank you for joining us.
Yeah.
And before you start, it seems that I made Patty Cometh the host. And so, Patty, if you could change the share screen to Ian, it would be most lovely.
Oh. I think I can share, so, oh, nope, never mind.
So what do I need to do?
So look at Ian's name on the list of participants.
Yeah.
And go to the right, and it says more, and it says make host.
Let's see here. To the right, that says more.
Way to the right of his name.
Make host.
Maybe
Got
the
it.
top right now.
Got it?
I think
There
so.
we go.
Technology, I love it.
All right. Let's see if I can share the right screen here. Okay. All right. And can you see? Oh, you can see my slides. And I wouldn't be where I am without Kathy. So big shout out to Kathy, who I've had the luxury of knowing for a long time. All right. Let's see if I can share the right screen now. Okay. Well, thanks for having me, everybody. As you heard, I'm the clinical ethicist currently at Children's Minnesota, and currently the only clinical ethicist at Children's Minnesota. But I'm fortunate to have a person joining me in August who's also a nurse by background and a clinical ethicist. So I'm building up the nursing presence and ethics around the Twin Cities. And so today I'm going to talk about something.
Who's joining you?
Her name is Shika Calivor. She is a NICU nurse by background. She initially worked in Seattle at Seattle Children's, and then did her master's in bioethics through, I believe, Harvard, and then did her fellowship also at Children's Mercy. Currently a teaching fellow at Harvard in bioethics, and coming here in Minnesota in August, thankfully in August. But,
Terrific. Thank you. I heard she was coming, but didn't know where.
yeah, so I was recruited her for quite some time, and finally convinced her. So this is something that really fits within my interest. As you heard, my interest in sort of how social, political, cultural issues affect ethics, and this is something that's obviously been in the news for better or worse these days, as we seem to be living in the best and the worst of times, as it were, depending on where you sit. So just a little bit of a roadmap where we're going to go today. I'm going to talk a little bit about the noise and just talk about what are the tensions and where are the things coming up around gender affirming care. And as I am a pediatric clinical ethicist, I'm going to focus a little bit on youth gender affirming care, as that's where some of the flashpoint is right now. But certainly this is going to play into gender affirming care overall for nursing. And as I get through some of the considerations, and then into the practical guidance of nursing ethics and what are nurses going to do, you'll see how this ties in not just to youth gender affirming care, but also into adults. And so this is a little bit of the current landscape. We've got everything from gender affirming care saves lives to its mutilation. You've got everywhere from protective bills in some states to outright bans and criminalization in other states. And so in terms of looking at gender affirming care, particularly for youth, it's a little bit of a it's depending on where you're at, it's either very troubling or very affirming, and if anything, a scary time to be a parent or a child in this situation. And so this kind of started for me, not just because I worked at Children's and where we have a gender clinic, but also where I think where this conversation really started as it applies for nursing was when Texas came out with their ban on gender affirming care. But it wasn't just really a ban, and it wasn't really a bill even. What it was the Attorney General redefined their child abuse statutes, and so that's undergoing some legal challenges based on its constitutionality on a state constitution level. So not constitutional in the terms of American Constitution, but just constitutional more in a sort of formalities debate. But the insidiousness of it was where it got into nursing and their social services, which they've lost thousands of social service workers because of this, is because it takes advantage of the mandatory reporting requirements and then pits clinicians in this odd state of having a legal obligation where their professional ethics might be at odds with that. And this really struck me as something, because this wasn't whether you agreed or disagreed with the process of gender affirming care, right? In which we'll get into the details of the difference in that in a little bit. But this said that no matter what you thought about it, no matter if you were a nurse that was somebody coming into your clinic and they were seeking some type of care, it really, although it got into a little bit of specifics, it was unclear on what your obligation was. And so it really put nurses in an interesting spot where they were essentially criminalizing their patients. And this was, for me, something that was quite compelling that we needed to address from the ANA particularly, but just as pediatric ethicists. And I do want to give a shout out, which I didn't put that slide up, but the Texas Nursing Association, their state, the ANA state, did an excellent job. My understanding is a pretty organized organization down there, and almost immediately had a statement of guidance out for nurses, actually showing through the code of ethics why the law was inconsistent with nursing ethics and practice. So, and since then, started us off into really big push towards criminalization. This is a 2022 table from JAMA that's already out of date, because many of these have either passed, some have been blocked or barred, but not completely off the table. And I put a little blurb here. Idaho just recently passed their laws restricting that, where physicians or parents can face up to 10 years in prison. And as you can see, there's even one, or it's not up here, but there's a couple of them that their initial push was to do life and license. And so over the legislative process has been jumped down a little bit here. But these laws range anywhere from sort of loss of licensure to prison time for both professionals and parents. And this isn't even getting into the sports bans, which some of the sports bans focus solely on barring athletes from playing in sports teams. But in some states, as in Ohio and Kansas, although it doesn't explicitly say this, so I don't want to play into some of the hyperbole, although there's a debate whether it's hyperbole or not. Although it doesn't explicitly say this, the only logical conclusion for some of the way the laws are represented is the way in which the suspicion of gender congruence has to be identified is by requiring genital exams or other types of medical testing, which brings up the issue of using nurses and physicians or other clinicians for non-medical uses, right? So potentially asking / compelling a school nurse or a physician to do an anatomical exam or physical exam for a non-medical reason. And so it brings up a lot of ethical issues around practice, as you can be rightly surmising. And so the current landscape now we've gotten here is, as you can see, the green is either no ban or has protections. The red has banned it, and the orange is consider the peat ring, are leaving a lot of people with, and let me know if my internet connection is a little unstable, but a lot of people in these peach states are having to make a lot of really hard choices, as well as a lot of clinicians. And so as an ethicist, right, good ethics always start with good facts. And so digging through some of the noise, trying to figure out, okay, well, what are the real issues here, right? And so the first question really is, what is gender affirming care? And this, I'm fortunate to work with some good colleagues, Dr. Miller and Dr. Gefford, who have been pretty vocal about getting to the actual substance of what are we talking about, right? And she says, in broad strokes, gender affirming care, and again, we're talking about youth here, is any other adolescent to feel affirmed on medical services for transgender, non-binary people. That's according to the United States Department of Human Health and Services, which they're talking about adults and children. But for most teenagers or younger children who come in with significant gender dysphoria, they're really feeling uncomfortable in bodies, and gender clinics are a place where they can be helped to navigate some of this. And I want to point out something kind of logically interesting is that where there are states where their gender affirming care is banned, intersex surgery may be allowed. And so, one of the reasons I point this out is when we're thinking about what is gender affirming care, and it goes right to surgical interventions, we are already doing or have done in the past surgical interventions for non-medical reasons on children to affirm not their own gender identity, but other people's view of what their gender identity look like or what their genitalia should look like. And so intersex folks are people born with what we consider sort of ambiguous genitalia, or what we prefer to call for children with differences of sex differentiation, right? So different anatomically appearing genitalia. And our general stance from an ethics perspective and a pediatric perspective is you should not do any surgery that isn't medically indicated, because you can't reverse that later if that child grows up and is okay with that or determines they're different. They prefer to see themselves differently, right? And so that's an interesting, I think, thing to consider when we consider about where this push for banning gender affirming care is. And gender affirming care for youth, theoretically, there's some kids that could qualify for surgery, but the majority of, and normally we would not do that. And so the majority of gender affirming care is a place where a kid and family can go, where everyone there has experience working with kids and families who are transgendered and diverse, and knows how to support their family in terms of the questions they're having, conflict within their family, and knows how to support their kids in their school system. And that's from Dr. Gefford. And just to sort of give a little overview of what we're actually talking about in technical terms here, this is sort of the process of gender affirmation, right? You have social affirmation, and that can be done at any age. Puberty blockers, generally during puberty, and both of these two things are reversible. And when you get into adolescence and later, there's some that will then move on to hormones, and these are partially reversible. And in general, there's and I'll get into the sort of the standard guidelines here too, but it's a slow, go slow process with a significant process prior to starting any of these things. And any other type of surgeries or legal affirmation, some depending on your state can happen anytime, but the surgeries themselves are generally referred only until they're in adulthood. So there is very few, if any, cases at this point that are being done surgically in youth. And so I like to get that out right away, because that's where some of the buzz goes, because I think it's a way to get their point over. And this is where we get into some of the ethical issues for gender affirming care in youth, right? It's, getting into the 4 principles of bioethics, where we're talking about beneficence. We want to maximize treatment benefit by also minimizing harm, recognizing the nuance of capacity, assent, and consent in adolescence, and also talking about fair process and access to appropriate care. And I point out this quote by Bear Carrington, who I've communicated with a little bit about some of these topics, and they point out this which I think is right. The central part of the debate around this is more harm done by providing gender affirming care or by watchful waiting, an approach that advocates observing a child's gender journey to see how the child's gender identity expressions evolve. And this really gets, I think, into the real debate that is necessary, and one we should be having in institutions that have these, is this is a hard space, right? We're talking about balancing the current harms for a child to the future harms or the risk of being wrong, right? So we're looking at the harm from waiting and the harm from being wrong. And beneficence and non-maleficence are a constant proportionality that we try to balance in pediatrics all the time, right? We have with gender dysphoria significant mental health issues, but we're also balancing sort of the future child as well, right? And so all of this is going to be a gentle balance. And part of this is because we get systemic and ethical risk, right? We think of things with pediatrics that are going to have potential ethical risks, right? So, when we're talking about, let me know if I freeze. I keep saying my internet's unstable, but I keep seeing my moving. So, when we're talking about things like removing or withholding life-sustaining treatments with children, we also want to have significant certainty, right? Because the ethical risks of being wrong are that we've removed it when we didn't need to and the child passed. And so this is not a new concept for pediatrics. And so when we're talking about gender affirming care, this is not something that doesn't have some ethical underpinnings already at work, right? And so we often talk about certainty that the harms have equipoise, right? So equipoise meaning we don't know which treatments might be beneficial, and so through social transition, things that are reversible before we get into things that are more permanent, but also that depends on the individual child. And this is something that's come up when I've talked about the bioethics of this, is because this is an individualized approach. This is not a one size fits all. And that is how these clinics operate or should operate. And part of this is a consideration to what we think of as a child's open future. We are protecting the child's future self and their future autonomous self. And so part of that is like we do with any teenager, which is balancing some of their choice and some of their certainty around who they are and what they want to do with themselves versus, their future, what their future self might want. And this is a constant balance we do with any teenager. And we also want to support their decision making in the process, because children have a burgeoning economy is kind of what we think, right? As they age, we want to have more of their input in what happens to their body. And this plays out on pediatrics quite a bit as we get into the teenage years, having them go through medical procedures. We want more of their assent in that, and we want more of their decision in this. And part of this gets into the idea of persistence too, and this comes up quite a bit when we're talking about this topic because we're concerned with persistence, right? We know that adolescence is a time of identity development, and certainly we can all think of the different identity points we've held through our teenage years. And I'm not conflating gender identity into a phase here, but I think the concern is there, and I think that there's some validity to those concerns from a position of trying to do what's best for the child. Now, the way in which we think about persistence and desistance is a different question that certainly has room for analysis, because while I think as the culture expands and we get more into expansive gender definitions and roles, so too might our ideas or might the normal development in this period change. And so how we think of this needs to change. And so in one sense, it's true that detransitioners are crucial to the science of gender care, but it's also true that how we define desistance might be flawed and might also expand. And so if we continue to think about desistance in a binary way versus looking at gender identity development in a journey, then we might actually wind up collecting bad data to then make bad policies or guidance. And so Bear Carrington is the first one who I've known that's actually sort of looked at this, and many of us are looking at how we're doing this, because the desistance literature is used quite a bit to attack gender affirming care. And there's the data out there is, because it's so new, is all over the place. There are studies years ago that will talk about 80% desistance rates, and there's newer studies that will actually show about 1 to 3% desistance rate, however we're sort of classifying that. And so that kind of leads us into sort of what do we do with that, right? And so we don't really know a lot, and the data is imperfect. Well, that speaks sort of to having good guidance and process, right? And that's what WPATH, the International Journal of Transgender Health, puts out for their international body, is that given the emerging nature of knowledge regarding adolescent gender identity development, an individualized approach to clinical care is considered both ethical and necessary. And that is really the ethical analysis, at least from my perspective, and most of the folks that I know, is that data is imperfect. It's not the first sort of healthcare that has imperfect data, and so that doesn't mean we have just a rubber stamp, and it also doesn't mean that it's needs to go away, right? That it's invalidated. What it means is that this is a individualized approach and balance, doing our due diligence and process for each individual family and child. And the healthcare itself has been affirmed by many different societies around the world and around the country, and some of our most respected and trusted organizations. There's a strong consensus among most prominent medical organizations worldwide that evidence-based gender affirming care for transgender children and adolescents is medically necessary and appropriate. It can even be life-saving. Again, we're talking about trying to improve kids' lives who are in a significant crisis. And one can make all sorts of theoretical arguments, like there might be a cure out there, and that might be true, but we're talking about taking care of children right now. And we have evidence-based treatment that has outcomes that significantly improve and save the lives of children. So, and this led us to, for the American Nurses Association, to put out a statement, and something I don't think have done quite as often throughout our history, opposing restrictions on transgender healthcare and criminalizing of gender affirming care. And we've been working on position statements around, we started working on a position statement around the criminalization of the care, and then they started criminalizing lots of other types of care. And so the position statement actually kind of morphed into a different product that's still being worked on. And this policy brief was largely supported by not just the ANA's policy statement on LGBTQ healthcare, but also the American Academy of Nursing's policy on this as well. And these position statements, this is the link for the position statement, which you can find for free online. It's on LGBTQ health. It's based on our code of ethics, and basically really situated in provision 1, which says the nurse practices with compassion and respect for the inherent dignity, worth, and unique attributes of every person. It affirms that the need for and right to healthcare is universal, transcending all individual differences, and supports protection against discrimination due to sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression. So, this is right there in our first provision with the code of ethics. And so this kind of brings us into, okay, well, what do we do as nurses, right? And so getting into, especially here in Minnesota, where we've passed bills as a refuge state now for folks seeking this, and not just for this, but for abortion care as well. And as you can see, why is this important to think about? Well, if you look at where Minnesota is, other than Illinois, we're surrounded by a significant amount of peach and red, right? And so you have folks who were once getting healthcare who are now not getting it. And so we've got considerations to think about for those folks seeking care here. And as NPR put out with Children's Minnesota recently, a story of families actually already moving from these states to Minnesota, but also crossing state lines to get healthcare. So what does this mean for nurses? Well, again, we practice with compassion and respect for the inherent dignity, worth, and unique attributes of every person. And these respect for patient decisions does not require that the nurse agree with or support all patient choices, right? And so I want to make this distinction here because this came out in a lot of discussions is, yeah, well, and even in our bioethics conferences, you're speaking from a specific view, political view, right? And so, but not everybody in the nursing organization agrees with this. And I say, yeah, I agree. That's okay. What we're not talking about here is that you agree or disagree with it. What we're talking about here is that you respect patient decisions that are decisions they can make, right? And this gets into sort of provision 2, right? Is that your primary commitment is to the patient, whether an individual, family, group, community, or population. And why this ends up a little bit going into provision 5, which is where the nurse owes the same duties to self as to others, including the responsibility to promote health and safety, preserve the wholeness of character and integrity, maintain competence, and continue with personal and professional growth. And why this is important, because this actually draws out 2 different responsibilities. One is for your personal and professional growth, character and integrity, right, and maintaining competence. So you have an obligation to know about this care, think about it, have a well-reasoned response to it. But you do also have a responsibility to the self, which gets into this a little bit of this personal versus professional issue that comes up with this, right? And so where this comes into is, well, what if I disagree with it? I mean, how do I balance my own personal views against my professional obligations here? Well, first of all, I think you have to look at what we're talking about when we're talking about gender affirming care. We're talking about using preferred name and pronouns? Are we talking about medically affirming care? Are we talking about surgical interventions, right? This is a good distinction because any conscious objection that you have to being involved in this has to have reason behind it. And so, on one level, if you're okay caring for somebody after have a surgical intervention of a mastectomy, is that any different than caring for a patient who's had top surgery? And the other issue here is that, using what's conscious objection versus discrimination. It might be reasonable to not be involved, just like as an abortion, not being involved in the abortion itself, but you as a nurse can't refuse to care for the person afterwards, right? And so that's a distinction that gets into to list out discrimination versus your right to conscious objection, because refusing refusing to use preferred name and pronouns is discrimination, right? The same way that it would be discrimination or disrespect, at least, if you refuse to address a patient by their preferred name, whether it was a name that's seemingly different from their gender or not, right? That's an element of disrespect. And it's also important to consider that the conscious objection must be balanced with patient's access to care. The primary right is of the patient to access care. And so this is why when you hear about stories and legal suits around people's access to contraceptives or medications, the consensus generally has been that conscious objections are respected, but patients' right to access care should come first, right? And so this is where we really get into this distinction between discrimination, which is a direct violation of provision 1, and the inherent dignity and worth of the patient. And I put this article here because there hasn't been any articles talking about this in nursing, although this has come up in nursing and at the ANA about people's right to consciously object from being involved. And our general stance is, yeah, like any controversial intervention, assuming that the patient still has the right to access that care, you can have a conscious objection against being involved in that procedure, but as a nurse, you can't refuse to take care of that patient after the fact. And this comes up a lot, has come up a lot with physician training in this way, in a little different way, because they're under GME regulations, and there are certain criteria and aspects of GME education that you must achieve going forward. And some of those are things like doing adolescent sexual history and things like that. And that gets into the same difference of, that's not really a conscious objection, that's either not being able to complete your training requirements or discrimination. So there are some responsibilities, though, with your right to conscious objection that nurses must consider. You have to express this to the appropriate authority, and again, conscious-based refusals to participate exclude preferences, prejudice, bias, convenience, or arbitrariness. All right, this needs to be an actual deeply held belief. It can't just be an arbitrary reason or based on, again, bias or discrimination. You don't have a right to object based on racism or bias or sexism, etc. So again, nurses are obliged to provide for patient safety, to avoid patient abandonment, and to withdraw only when assured that nursing care is available to the patient. Again, patients can't. Did I come back? Sorry about that. Okay, I need to get my screen back though. Could somebody make me the host again? All right. Sorry, for some reason, evenings for my internet are never great. I tried to prioritize my screen, but okay. All right, so now we get into, again, some of the professional versus legal issues. Oops. Okay. And this is something that I've been really interested in over the last couple of years, and have written a couple ethics inboxes about, because we've really seen this around the country, this tension between mandated reporting laws, which some of these states are using to compel nurses then to criminalize their patients for things that, from an ethics perspective, are their rights to should respect. And a couple ways this comes up is, one, what do nurses do, right? And this is the hard part, because we want to say, yeah, well, just don't report them, right? But that assumes that the nurse has some position of power or privilege where they are able to just ignore that, right? And you imagine a nurse, and this has happened in Texas, who a patient comes in and they're receiving gender affirming care, and although the law somewhat states what type of care that is, they end up reporting their patient because they're scared. Not every nurse can afford the risk of losing their license or livelihood. And while nobody's ever been tried for it yet, it's still a big fear, as we saw with abortion in Texas, where a nurse did turn in a patient who had come in after either a miscarriage or an abortion. The other thing that's coming up that's a little more prescient for Minnesota nurses is, what do we do when patients come here to receive care and are going back to a state where it's criminalized? And this has a tough tension, because I've talked to plastic surgeons and others who deal with, when they're adults, undergoing some of these types of care, and they're seeking surgical options, and doing their due diligence, want to see, has this person gone through therapy? Have they gone through all the clinics and the stages of getting to this point where they're making a decision that is right for them, and the physician is acting in a way that is right for the patient? And what they're worried about, and what's somewhat starting to happen, is that because physicians that they're seeking will criminalize these patients when they get back. I'm going to turn my video off just to make sure And so what they're looking at doing is, do they do shadow charts, meaning do they make a separate chart that they give and print out to the patient? But then there's always that worry, right, of is that really doing good for the patient, who later on might be seeking this? The worry there is that if by putting it in the chart, they go back and the parents or whoever are then, it's found out and then are charged legally. And then there's the concern of the physician themselves. As we've seen, the vitriol has turned to physicians, and we've gotten the number of people, calling children's and sending emails and things like that. Here, we haven't gotten quite the level that Boston Children's did, where they got bomb threats, but we've been targeted a few times by some of these groups targeting clinicians and hospitals. So there's also that concern as well. And then in Indiana, of course, we saw the Attorney General start to target the physician who performed an abortion as well. So there's definitely some tensions, and not a lot of really good answers around, how do we do what's best for these patients? And this gets a little bit into the things I am always don't ever feel good to me, but I think are important provisions nonetheless, is sort of advocacy, right, and collective effort to maintain and improve the ethical environment of the work setting and conditions of employment that are conducive to safe, quality health care. And provision 9, nursing collectively through its professional organizations must articulate nursing values, maintain the integrity of the profession, and integrate principles of social justice into health policy. And so these are not easy, and these are not easy times to be in, and there's a lot of noise out there. And I think really getting past some of it, and in some there's a reasonable concern. We want to do what's best for children. We want to provide good health care. It's reasonable to worry that some clinics aren't following good process, sure. But unfortunately, there are some out there who are using this as a political tool to spread fear to increase a voting base. And that's just the facts, because I'm validating that there are credible concerns and reasons to critique this type of care. Absolutely, 100%. There's a lot we don't know. There's a lot we do know. And then in between, there's a lot of uncertainty, right? And that's always needs good process. But gender affirming care is appropriate health care. Nurses have an obligation to the patient. Conscious objection is a right and an important one, but the refusing to participate in an action that might be in conflict with personally held moral, religious, or beliefs. But let's not confuse that with discrimination, which is refusing to care for someone due to their identity. It's also important that you know your state laws. This is something that hopefully we'll address in the new revision to the Code of Ethics, because this really isn't addressed in the current one. It's something that a few of us have an article coming out in Advanced Nursing Science about, but what do nurses do when the state laws seem to be bad for their patients and violate their professional ethics? And there's no really easy answer to that. I mean, one is that you have an obligation to follow the law and your code of ethics, and Antigone's never been more relevant these days, but that's kind of where some nurses in some states are stuck by. And this isn't just about gender affirming care or abortion. There's actually quite a few laws in different states that seemingly don't jive with the nursing professional code of ethics. And but also know your code of ethics as well. That's really important, because when you're in your professional practice, it's really looked upon whether you followed your code of ethics or not in caring for your patient, particularly if it's something that conflicts with the law and you are making the choice to follow your code of ethics over the law. That will guide you in any problems that arise later on. And also, if you are having conflicts about certain interventions that you don't want to be involved with, definitely contact your leadership earlier rather than later. Again, as somebody who works in an institution, we want to respect people's conscious-based objections and their, deeply held moral or religious beliefs. But, patients are primary, and, their right to access care will come before your conscious-based objection. And I think that is it. And hopefully I left that. Thanks. So that was pretty quick and down to it, but ultimately the issues I don't think are all that complicated. The noise has just made them more complicated, and really from a nursing aspect, this is no different to me than lots of other controversial issues that have come up over the years. And I don't want to minimize people's feelings about this, and I do want to validate the confusion, concerns, etc. about some of these things, but keeping in mind that nurses have obligations, and again, separating personal and professional opinions about these.
Excellent presentation. And I just want to open up the floor to comments, thoughts. And my personal thought was just, I was struck by the way that you wove in the nursing code of ethics into this. And we have Martha on the line, and Martha was obviously key to putting pen to paper. I went to grad school and had that book, next to me, took my nursing ethics class, and just a perfect application. So I just want to say that. So
Thank you.
Others, please share your thoughts, feelings about this topic.
Ian, this is Martha.
Hi, Martha.
Hey there. It was terrific. Thank you so much for doing that. As you know, we're beginning to get ready to revise the Code of Ethics again. And so many of the points that you raised, we need to make sure are included and expanded in ways that they fully address and cover the situations that you addressed in your presentation tonight. So you're doing some great work, and I'm really glad you're in Minnesota.
Huh?
I'm glad I'm in Minnesota these days too.
Yeah. Ditto.
I really like your points, just like, be sure we know what we're talking about, that, that the conflation of the topic, when, this is really what we're talking about, not this, and make sure that we have a common
Mhm.
definition of what it really is before we start going down the path. And then the thing about the state laws, and, that is really challenging, especially for the nurses who are in the multi-state compact, because they're really being impacted by it in a way that they don't even understand yet. So it's a huge challenge for the nurse license compact states. It's a huge challenge for all of us, but even bigger for them.
Yeah, and there's, the Missouri bill that just came out, there's concerns that it's somewhat expanded kind of under the radar into adult care, which of course has some other, not to mention sort of the illogic of, banning some patients from seeking, altering surgeries or, quote unquote, altering surgeries, but then, not others. There's really some inconsistent logic behind it, but that just makes it that much more confusing than for nurses who are stuck in the middle of this sort of political game, or using people's lives as political games, really. So, the same thing's not being talked about for plenty of other types of altering surgeries. So, and I don't want to conflate gender affirming surgery with altering surgeries, but from an ethics standpoint, it's very noticeable where the attacks are going, right? It's so. I haven't heard much of it come up in nursing education yet, so I don't know if that's hopeful or not. Yeah, I'm sorry, David, did you?
Ian, thank you very much. This was incredibly, I found it very interesting. And from a clinical perspective, when I worked in an emergency room, we had a situation where I was told that you were going to assist with an abortion because they couldn't do it quote unquote, they couldn't do it upstairs. So I didn't know that till right before. The idea that then the Code of Nursing was not a book that I carried. It became a real life thing. And I said to the physician, the surgeons involved, I said, my care will be of the patient and I will be at the head and I will support her throughout the entire thing as I would any patient. I found this very disturbing because, not disturbing, but it was, with everything else going on, it was very fraught. And afterwards, I had no one I could just think of that I could talk to. This was a very disturbing situation. I was very happy with how I cared for the patient, but the struggle, I wanted to talk to someone about it, and I found that administration didn't want to hear it. A lot of the nurses went, well, just suck it up. That's too bad. Sometimes we all do things we don't like. Too bad. And it haunted me other than the fact that I felt I did very good care of the patient. That was my saving grace.
Yeah.
The issue itself, I found difficult to deal with. So my point I'm trying to make is that we also have to be sensitive to our peers that we're working with, who may be going through some of these decisions, which are, as you stated really clearly, they're not, many times is not a right answer to. But it's
Right.
why that code is so important, because that does guide what it is that you do, and you can be satisfied with the work that you did because you kept to the code.
Yeah.
I'll-
No, it's a good point to try to remember to respect people when they have, you know, deeply held beliefs, or if they're in process of trying to figure out, you know, we do very infrequently sterilizing surgeries on children with disabilities, and that's a highly controversial topic, and one that's, you know, it's fraught with ethical tension. There's some reasons that to do it, and there's other reasons why we shouldn't do it. And we have a really good process of when we approve it or not, right? And certainly I would want to respect people's conscience to not be a part of it. But I would, you'd say, like, you know, if that child's in the a med surg floor afterwards, you know, a nurse can't refuse to care. But I want to, it's important to know for leaders to support that person,
Mhm.
you know, in that like validate that. I mean, again, making a distinction between discrimination
Right.
and conscious objection.
Mhm.
Susan, I hate to put you on the spot, but I know you are working with BSN students. I'm curious to know if this comes up in conversation or in any classroom, you know, curriculum.
Yes, thank you so much. I've just been throughout this wonderful presentation thinking about all the conversations we've had across the programs, from BSN to master's to DMP to PhD. And I will tell you that I'm just so impressed with how open and compassionate and comparing our students are. You know, really gives me hope for the future of nursing, and just how you know, they don't see necessarily the differences. You know, what can I do to support this patient and family?
Mhm.
You know, and yes, I teach ethics, and yes, they have to read every word of the code, every word. We take one provision per week, and they totally pull that provision apart word for word, and we have great discussions. So, and when they're in their final semester, both grads and masters, I have them carry the code with them to their clinical immersion.
I love it.
And I asked them to ask their preceptor if they've ever read the code. I said, don't do it the first week. Wait till they get to know you. Oh, because, you know, the code has saved me many, many times in my long career. It has helped me sleep at night,
Yeah.
you know? Yeah, and those ethical issues. And I worked a long time in neonatal and peds ICU, and think about all the surgeries we did early on. So anyway, I'll stop. But yes, it's certainly at the University of Minnesota, I feel very fortunate in the open conversations that we have, you know, and it's a safe place for students to really talk about what's happening, what they're seeing in clinical, and you know, how the code can really be a guide for them. Thanks, Addie.
You know, I can only imagine what it's like to be in a school of nursing and some of the, what, as Ian said, peach or red states. You know, it would be a very different experience to be learning.
Well,
Yeah.
and we hear them say, we're never moving from Minnesota. We're not
Yeah,
moving.
there's been a lot of talk about that, especially with training programs more for, I think, physicians, especially like OB residents
Yeah.
who, you know, as part of their training curriculum, and now it's can't actually complete it because of some of those states. So
Yeah.
Anyone else, thoughts, reflections?
You know, I have a question. If just in terms of beneficence, and for those people who have no political motivation whatsoever, just truly have the, I don't want to cause any harm now or in the future. Is there data on non-reversible care? And I know that's not, you said that that was a small percentage, but non-reversible
Yeah.
care for pediatrics for whom those children become adults and then regret that that care was done. Is there data on that? Do you know what I'm
Yeah, a
asking?
little. I mean, that's a really good question, and I think one we've all been, I mean, for myself too, wanting to see. And I think more and more of those studies are coming out. There was a couple of recent ones in pediatrics, and I didn't include them ultimately in the end of the slides because I was getting more away from the data. But there's the current ones are showing only about like 1 or 2% desistance rates. And again, you know, there's not a lot of diving in from a, you know, the ethics person wants to really dive into, well, what do you mean by that? Because you know, if we're thinking in binary, that's not always what the desistance means, you know, right? It might be more non-binary. There's also been some studies looking at those, the majority of those that did make some sort of change in their journey, did so mostly because of social pressures or barriers. And so all this to me speaks as an ethicist, right? To, well, does it really, you know, we don't really know, right? And so from an adolescent perspective, as an ethics person, right, we're talking about balancing. Look, we have, you know, suppose you've got a child who's got significant mental health issues, gender dysphoria, right? You're trying to balance with doing what's good currently, and with also keeping that sort of right to an open future and doing what's good for them, you know, right? And there's sort of risks in both ways. And so the best way to go forward when there's uncertainty is good process, right? And you know, you can't know the future, but you should then have due diligence. And so my, you know, the clinic I work with, my institution takes a very, you know, it's all balance based on that individual, right? If there's a kid who's having continued issues with that dysphoria, then you're more inclined to maybe move in a little bit more invasiveness, right? A little more towards the sort of non-reversible stuff, right? Especially as they get and that's just, you know, any kind of pediatrics really is an individualized approach on that, for any type of care. And because there is that laying out there, right? And as it becomes more okay to sort of talk about it, you know, we may even see adolescent development change into being more of that type of gender, you know, development and exploration, right? And so, especially as societal gender norms change or blend, and that's something we don't really know, right? And so we want to take that into consideration. And you know, and the clinicians at my clinic will tell you, you know, they get parents that show up that are like, I don't know why I'm here. I'm doing anything. Martha, do you have a question? You're on mute.
Sorry, I couldn't hear you, Ian, from what the last remarks you made.
Oh. So to answer Celeste's question is, yeah, I mean, those are real tensions that we deal with in pediatrics all the time. And it's a balance, and it's balancing the current harms from the future harms. But and maybe you missed the part of, so we have parents that come in that want to get right going with it and want meds prescribed right away. And then you have parents that come in that don't believe in it at all. And the same process is taken with them, and first sort of a slow down. This, you know, we don't just hand these things out like candy. There's a process. You meet with the team, you go through social transition, you go through a lot of mental health counseling. The main focus of it is to really work on their mental health and sense of identity and help them through the journey, not to get right in and you know, that may be a part of it. But again, because we're trying to balance on doing good and not doing harm. And that might change for different kids. You know, a kid who's had a pretty firm identity from the age of 3, you know, we might treat differently than a kid who's 13 and walking in.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Well, it looks like we're at the top of the hour here. And so with that, I think we're going to end up closing off our conversation, which I could see going long. Really good topic, excellent information. Ian, are these slides something that you're comfortable sharing with us?
Oh, sure.
Okay, great.
Yeah, I'm sorry for all my technical Wi-Fi issues.
It wouldn't be a Zoom meeting without that,
Yeah,
Ian.
Ian, if you just send the, Ian, if you just send the slides to me, I can distribute.
Okay, great. And you'll,
Okay.
and for those on the call, you know, you'll be getting kind of a survey from us. And if you complete that, then in response, you'll get your CEU certificate. But I think somebody had something to say. Sorry if I cut you off. No? Okay. All right. Well, thanks everybody for your time. Ian, in particular, thanks for all the prep you put into this. I think we're all leaving wiser. So, and Martha, thank you for the ethics. All right. Bye, everybody.
Bye.